Have you ever wondered if a dog could sense danger before it even happens? Max, a German Shepherd with eyes sharper than most, felt it long before anything could be seen or heard. That foggy night, when the air seemed thicker than usual, something inside Max stirred. It wasn't just a simple restlessness. No, it was as if the night itself held a secret, one that only Max could sense. Mark, his owner, was preparing to leave the house in a rush, as if driven by an unseen force. He didn't notice Max's piercing gaze, nor did he feel the strange energy that hung in the air. With quick steps, Mark grabbed his coat, kissed his wife goodnight, and headed for the door, seemingly unaware of the sense of urgency that gripped the house. But Max couldn't let go of his unease. His ears perked up, his body tense. The house felt too quiet, the air too still. Was it just another regular night? Or was something deeper at play? Mark turned the key, at the sound echoing in the quiet house. Max's eyes tracked him, a growl building in his throat. This wasn't normal. Max's instincts screamed at him to stop Mark, to somehow warn him. But how could a dog, so loyal and perceptive, communicate something as complex as impending danger? As Mark closed the door behind him, the heavy silence settled back into the house, but not in Max's heart. He was wide awake, his senses on fire, feeling the weight of a moment he could not understand fully, but knew he must act upon. As Mark's footsteps faded into the night, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a spectator to his owner's life. He was a protector, a guardian. Something wasn't right. And as Mark moved further away, Max's unease only deepened. His eyes darted back and forth, unable to rest, as if his mind was trying to piece together the warning that hadn't yet revealed itself. Max was no ordinary dog. His instincts, honed by years of companionship with Mark, had always been spot on. Yet tonight, there was something different, something unsettling that Max couldn't quite understand, but he could feel it in his bones. Normally, he would lay by the door, content in his vigil, his tail sweeping lazily across the floor. But tonight, his pacing was relentless. He trotted from the door to the window, his nails clicking against the wooden floor, only to turn around and repeat the process, his eyes wide and alert. His gaze was locked on the outside world, scanning every shadow, every sound, every movement. It was as though the night was holding its breath. His low growls reverberated through the quiet house, vibrating the stillness like an unspoken warning. The growl wasn't a typical sign of alert. This was deeper, more urgent, almost like a hum of electricity running through him. Max was aware, more aware than ever before. He wasn't just barking at the usual sounds of the night. This was different. His ears were forward, his body tense, his muscles coiled as if preparing to spring into action at any moment. Every now and then, Max would dart to the window, his eyes fixated on the misty street outside. It was as though he was trying to make sense of the fog, of the shadowy figures that seemed to fade in and out of view. But it wasn't just the fog that troubled him. It was something he couldn't explain, something in the air, something unseen but intensely felt. Mark was gone, and Max's instincts told him it wasn't just the absence of his owner that made him uneasy. It was the tension in the very air around him. There was danger out there. He could smell it. Max's head snapped toward the door again. He stopped pacing for just a moment, standing still as a statue. His nostrils flared, catching the faintest whiff of something unfamiliar. Something that made his heart beat faster. His gaze shifted to the front door, and without a second thought, he padded toward it, scratching at the wood with his paws. His persistence grew. He wasn't asking to be let outside. He was trying to break free. His protective instincts were too strong to ignore. Something was wrong. He had to get to Mark. And in that moment, it was clear. Max wasn't just a dog. He was Mark's protector, his guardian. And nothing would stop him from reaching his owner. Mark, though fond of Max's protective nature, couldn't understand the depth of his dog's unease. To him, it was just another night, another routine. Max had always been the excited, loyal dog who would show a bit of extra energy whenever Mark was about to leave the house. The wagging tail, the eager eyes. It was nothing new. So when Max began pacing and growling softly, Mark brushed it off. "Just wanting to go out for a walk, huh, boy?" he muttered with a half smile, already adjusting his coat. He didn't know that this time it wasn't excitement. It was something far more intense. But Mark didn't pause to wonder. He had his mind set on a quick errand. The evening was calling him out, a quick meeting with an old friend, something that required his immediate attention. Mark was busy. The world outside had its pull on him, and in his mind, Max's behavior was just a reminder of how his loyal dog was always eager for companionship and a change of scenery. With a final glance at Max, Mark closed the door behind him, the soft click of the lock ringing through the hallway. It wasn't the first time he'd left Max at home, and he felt a certain comfort knowing his dog would be there, waiting for him to return. But Max wasn't comforted. Max watched his owner leave with a sense of growing disquiet. His head tilted slightly, eyes never leaving Mark, even as the door shut behind him. Something deep inside Max resisted the very idea of Mark stepping out into the foggy night. His instincts screamed at him, a deep, almost primal urge to stop him. But Max was trapped inside the house. He pawed at the door again, his heart pounding faster now. Every second felt like an eternity as Mark's footsteps faded into the distance. Max's body tensed, his muscles coiling with a sharp sense of foreboding. He wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, a sentinel, and his bond with Mark transcended words or even simple affection. The silence that followed Mark's departure wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. Max knew something wasn't right, but all he could do was wait. Every second that passed only deepened his unease. He had to get out. He had to find Mark. And as the house grew eerily quiet around him, Max's instinctual drive to protect surged, becoming the only thing that mattered in the world. Max's frustration grew with every passing second. He had never felt this way before, not even when Mark had been away on long trips or when unexpected noises echoed in the distance. This time, something was different. He could feel it in his paws, in the pit of his stomach, in the way his senses were on edge, firing at full capacity. His tail flicked restlessly, and his ears swiveled as if trying to catch some sound beyond the walls, some sign of danger that only he could sense. With a low, guttural growl deep in his throat, Max began pacing again. He couldn't sit still. His body was buzzing with an energy he couldn't control. He was trapped inside, and Mark was out there, unaware of the threat that loomed closer with every passing second. His growls grew louder, more insistent. Max was trying to communicate, to do anything that would make Mark understand the urgency of the situation. But the walls of the house and the distance between them kept him from reaching his owner. His paws scratched at the door in rapid succession, the sound echoing through the hallway. Max wasn't just scratching at the wood. He was clawing for something more. He was clawing for action, for a way to break through the barrier that separated him from Mark. The door had never felt so solid, so unyielding. The wood seemed almost to mock his frantic desperation. His heart raced as his mind screamed for movement, for a way to break free, to reach Mark before it was too late. He could sense something terrible coming, something wrong in the air. Every part of him knew that Mark needed him, but how could he get to him? How could he warn him? The urgency in Max's behavior escalated. He stood on his hind legs and pressed his paws harder against the door, his nails scraping with force. The sound of his desperate attempts filled the quiet house, but nothing could break through the sense of foreboding that enveloped him. Then, for a split second, Max stopped. His ears perked, his breathing shallow as he heard something. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a wave of cold terror through him. It was Mark's voice, but distorted by the wind, and Max's instincts screamed that it was too late, that the danger had already arrived. His heart pounded in his chest as he took one last look at the door, knowing he couldn't wait any longer. Time was running out. He had to act now. The engine of Mark's car hummed as he navigated the winding road, the fog pressing in from all sides, making the drive feel even more isolating. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind focused on the road ahead, but deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He had ignored Max's strange behavior earlier, assuming it was just the usual excitement. But now, as he drove through the twisting curves, that gut feeling only intensified. Meanwhile, inside the house, Max's concern reached a breaking point. The moment Mark's car was out of sight, the first howl escaped from Max's throat. It was sharp and raw, echoing through the empty halls, resonating with a primal urgency. He howled again, louder this time, his voice a desperate plea that reverberated into the quiet night. It wasn't just a bark of boredom or a call for attention. It was a howl of warning, a call of alarm. Max could feel the distance between him and Mark growing with every second, and the panic inside him intensified. The howl seemed to carry through the neighborhood, filling the air with a sense of unease. But to Mark so far down the road, it was nothing more than a faint, distant echo. He couldn't hear Max's cries. He didn't know his dog was in turmoil, sensing the very thing he had yet to realize. Danger was closing in. As Max's howls continued, his body was wound tight with tension, his eyes fixed on the door. He stood at the window, watching for any sign of Mark's return, his chest rising and falling with each breath, desperate to break free. The night outside seemed to close in on him, amplifying his fear, but Max remained focused, his instincts guiding him. With each howl, the worry in Max's heart grew stronger. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of discomfort anymore. Max knew, deep down, that something terrible was about to happen. And all he could do was howl into the night, hoping, praying that somehow, somewhere, Mark would hear him. But the distance between them was vast, and Mark was still too far away to know that the night he had stepped out into was not ordinary. It was a night of danger. And Max was the only one who felt it. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly now. The fog outside seemed to press against the car like a living entity, blurring everything ahead. His thoughts, once focused on the mundane tasks of the day, now swirled in a cloud of unease. He tried to brush it off. After all, he was just on his way to meet a friend. It should have been a simple drive, a few minutes to unwind, but the sense that something was wrong gnawed at him, deep in his gut. He shifted in his seat, trying to shake the discomfort, but it only grew stronger. The radio, usually a comforting companion during his drives, remained silent tonight, the soft hum of the engine the only sound. Mark had never been a particularly anxious person, but this night felt different. The usual clarity of his thoughts was clouded, replaced by a vague, persistent feeling of dread. It was as if a shadow was trailing him, one that he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to focus on the road ahead. As Mark approached the intersection, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, then to his side windows. The road behind him seemed empty, too empty. Where were the other cars? Where was the usual flow of traffic? His gaze returned to the road in front of him, but even there, the fog seemed to stretch out endlessly, swallowing any sign of familiarity. He should have been calm. He always had been. But tonight, there was an unfamiliar restlessness in his chest, a flutter of nervousness that wouldn't leave. The intersection loomed ahead, and Mark could feel his pulse quickening. Every turn felt too sharp, every street sign seemed out of place. He reached to adjust the rearview mirror, but his hand hovered, unsure. It was as if he wasn't in control of his own body, like the world around him had shifted ever so slightly, throwing everything off balance. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it didn't help. The feeling of being disconnected from his usual self tightened around him, each second stretching longer than the last. It was at that very moment, as the car neared the intersection, that Mark's nerves finally caught up with him. The fog seemed to grow thicker, the road before him narrowing into a twisting path. He tried to focus, but it was clear. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just in his mind. Something far more sinister was closing in. Mark's heart slammed against his chest as the car suddenly lost traction. The tires squealed in protest, helpless against the slick ice that had appeared out of nowhere. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. His foot slammed on the brake, but the car didn't respond. It was as if the road had turned into a sheet of glass, sending his car spinning into chaos. His mind raced, thoughts a blur as he desperately tried to regain control. The steering wheel jerked violently in his hands, and he could feel the car's momentum pulling him toward the edge of the road. The fog around him thickened, closing in like a suffocating shroud, making it even harder to see anything beyond the blur of the windshield. His grip on the wheel tightened as panic surged in his chest, but no matter how hard he wrenched the car to the side, it wouldn't stop. The icy patch had a hold on him, and he could feel it. The car was losing the battle. In that horrifying moment, everything went silent. Mark's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted between the road and the rapidly approaching danger. The trees on the side of the road seemed to move closer, the headlights casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. His mind flashed through every moment of his life. the mundane days, the people he had loved, the moments of regret. It was as though the universe had pressed the pause button on reality. But then, just as he braced himself for the impact, the deafening sound of a bark pierced the silence. It was powerful, raw, and unmistakably Max. The bark tore through the stillness, and for a split second, Mark felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline, as if that single sound had pulled him out of the downward spiral. It wasn't just a bark, it was a warning, a call that cut through the chaos, as if Max had known from miles away exactly what was happening. The sound of Max's bark was like a lifeline, a tether to reality that Mark hadn't realized he needed. His mind cleared for just a moment, and in that heartbeat of clarity, he fought the steering wheel harder, instinctively turning it away from the oncoming danger. It wasn't enough to stop the car, but the sound of Max's bark had triggered something deep inside him. It was a reminder, a call to fight, a reminder of the bond they shared. Mark's heart still pounded in his chest as he fought for control, but Max's voice had given him a renewed sense of urgency. It was as though the universe had conspired for just that one moment of connection between them, and it made all the difference. Max could feel it in every fiber of his being. His owner was in danger. His instincts, so finely tuned over the years, screamed at him. His paws clawed at the floor, his heart racing as panic surged through his chest. He had never felt this helpless before, never this out of control. The desperate howls, the pacing, the frantic energy had all led to this moment. Mark was somewhere out there, unaware, and Max couldn't stand it any longer. With a surge of adrenaline, Max bolted toward the door, his nails clicking against the floor as he threw himself against it. He didn't just paw at the wood, he scratched, his claws digging into the door, pulling and tugging as though he could tear it down with sheer willpower. The air around him was thick with the urgency of his actions, each scratch echoing in the silence of the house. The door, normally just a simple barrier, now felt like an insurmountable wall, one that kept him from reaching Mark, one that separated him from his beloved owner. His muscles were locked in a frenzy of motion, the frantic scratching only growing more intense. Max's eyes were wide with a burning focus, his body trembling with both fear and determination. Every second that passed, every moment that he remained inside, felt like an eternity. The feeling in his chest was suffocating, as if the weight of his loyalty and love for Mark had become too much for his heart to bear. He had to break through. He had to get to him. Max's desperate actions were fueled by something primal. He knew his place in this world. He was Mark's protector. They had a bond that went beyond mere companionship. It was instinctual, a deep connection that couldn't be explained. And tonight, that bond was pushing him to the edge, to the point where nothing else mattered except getting to Mark. His fur bristled, his breath ragged as he scratched harder, pulling with all his strength. The door groaned in protest, but Max didn't stop. He could feel Mark's life hanging by a thread, slipping away with each passing moment. Time was running out, and Max knew it. He had no choice but to keep going, to do everything in his power to get to his owner, before it was too late. The car skidded again, the tires slipping helplessly across the icy road. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white with the strain. His heart was racing, every beat echoing in his ears. The fog outside had grown so thick, it felt like the world had shrunk to nothing but swirling white. Mark could barely see the road ahead, only the soft glow of his headlights cutting through the haze, illuminating the endless stretch of slippery pavement beneath him. He tried to focus, tried to steady his breath, but his hands shook uncontrollably as he fought with the wheel. The car seemed to have a mind of its own, jerking in directions he couldn't predict. His chest tightened with panic, and for a split second, it felt like the world was closing in on him. I have to regain control. I have to make it through this, he thought, trying to push away the rising fear that gripped him. With every second that passed, the road ahead seemed more and more like an obstacle course. Mark could feel the car sliding, slipping, his desperate attempts to correct it only making things worse. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He couldn't get into an accident, not tonight. Not when he still had so much left to do, so much he hadn't yet experienced. And Max was waiting for him. The thought of his loyal German shepherd, probably frantic at home, only added to the weight pressing down on his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. With trembling hands, he made one last desperate attempt. His foot pressed harder on the brake, and he turned the wheel sharply to the right. The car skidded further, and in that instant, everything seemed to blur into chaos. The cold metal of the car, the fog, the fear, it all came together in a moment of pure tension. Mark's heart pounded louder than the sound of the tires screeching. Not yet. Not yet, please. Mark silently pleaded with himself as the car fought against the ice, his mind screaming to stay focused, to regain control, to survive. But it wasn't just about staying alive. It was about getting back to Max, back to the one creature who depended on him. And as he took that final, panicked turn, the car's fate hung in the balance. Would his desperate action be enough to save him, or was this the moment it all went wrong? Time seemed to stretch, each moment dragging like an eternity. The car was no longer under Mark's control. The steering wheel felt like a lifeless object in his hands, unable to respond to his desperate commands. His breath quickened, his chest tightening as the reality of the situation hit him. The tree ahead loomed closer with every passing second, its gnarled branches reaching out like the fingers of fate, ready to claim him. Mark's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of the tires screeching across the icy road. His thoughts scattered, swirling around him in a dizzying blur. He didn't have time to think about the future or the life he could have had. All he could focus on was the harsh, unyielding reality of the moment. The tree was coming at him fast. His mind went blank for a split second as he braced for impact, knowing this might be the end. His hands gripped the wheel with all his remaining strength, knuckles pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. His breath came out in short, ragged gasps as he braced for the crash he knew was inevitable. There was no way to stop it now. The road was slick with ice, the fog thicker than ever. It was too late to react, too late to turn. The tree, so close now, was a harbinger of destruction. But just as Mark's muscles tensed for the brutal collision, something miraculous happened. The car, as if powered by some unseen force, lurched to a halt, its tires skimming the ice with barely an inch to spare. The front of the car jerked violently, and Mark was thrown forward, his seatbelt digging into his chest as his body slammed back against the seat. The car came to a sudden, jolting stop, just inches away from the massive trunk of the tree. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. He was alive. The car was still whole. For a split second, everything was frozen. His pulse raced, his breath ragged and shallow, as he tried to process what had just happened. He had narrowly avoided death, but how? His mind searched for answers, but none came. The fog outside remained thick, the world still a blur. He slowly exhaled, feeling the weight of his body pressing against the seat. He was alive, but it had been a close call. A very close call. The tree had been just a breath away from claiming him. Silence was almost deafening, like the entire world had exhaled in unison after holding its breath for too long. The car was still, its engine quietly humming as if nothing had happened. But Mark was anything but calm. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of how close he had come to disaster. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, too weak to move, too overwhelmed to take action. He sat there, frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. The tree that had been mere inches from his windshield, the sound of the tires screeching, the wild ride, it all felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't shake. But it wasn't a dream. It was reality, and the reality was that he was alive. He had been seconds away from crashing, from losing everything, but somehow, against all odds, the car had stopped. Mark let out a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling with the deep inhale. His mind raced, replaying the moments in an endless loop, his desperate attempts to steer, the terrifying slide on the ice, the moments before the crash. He could still feel the tension in his body, the muscles stiff with adrenaline, the remnants of panic lingering in his veins. But there was also a deep, overpowering wave of relief that washed over him. His body seemed to sag into the seat, the tension melting away, but only slightly. It was as if his body had been holding its breath right alongside him, and now that it was over, it didn't quite know how to release that last bit of fear. His hands were still on the wheel, but now they felt heavier, like they didn't belong there anymore. He slowly, cautiously let go and placed them in his lap, trying to steady himself, trying to find a sense of control again. The road ahead remained a blur through the fog, but the immediate danger had passed. Mark was alive. He could hardly believe it, but it was true. He had survived. And yet, as the silence stretched on, a strange feeling settled in. He wasn't just shaken by the close call. He was shaken by the overwhelming loss he had almost faced. The realization hit him hard, and the weight of what had almost been crushed him. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Mark's breath came slower now, but his heart continued to race as the reality of the situation seeped in. Max's desperation reached a boiling point. His body was a coiled spring of pent-up energy, his every movement fueled by an overwhelming sense of urgency. His once calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by a frantic need to break free. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a protector, a sentient being driven by an unshakable connection to his owner, Mark. Max knew something was wrong. The air inside the house felt thick with tension, and despite the stillness, Max could feel the world outside shifting. He wasn't going to sit idly by. Not now. Not when Mark needed him most. With every scratch at the door, Max's frustration grew. His claws scraped against the wood, his body buckling with the force of his attempts. The door, once just a simple barrier between inside and outside, had now become a prison. But Max wouldn't let it stop him. He pressed his nose to the wood and sniffed, trying to detect any sign of Mark's return. But all he could sense was the lingering unease. Something out there was wrong. He could feel it. His instincts were screaming at him that Mark was in danger, that this wasn't just an ordinary night. Max backed up, his eyes never leaving the door, and with a renewed sense of determination, he launched himself at it again. His paws slammed against the wood, and this time he dug his claws into the cracks between the doorframe, pulling, tugging with everything he had. He knew he had to get out. Mark was out there somewhere, and Max had to be with him. The bond they shared went beyond the physical. It was something deeper, something Max couldn't explain, but felt in his very soul. He had to be with Mark. His howls, once desperate, were now full of raw emotion. They echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls as if reaching out into the night. Max was pleading, not just with the door, but with the universe itself. Let me through. His mind raced with one goal, to reach Mark. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that the danger wasn't over. He had to act, had to get to his owner before it was too late. His loyalty was unwavering, and nothing, not even a locked door, was going to stop him now. Mark's hands were still trembling as he reached for his phone, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. He couldn't focus. The car was still parked on the side of the road, the tires gripping the icy surface, and the tree he had nearly collided with loomed just a few feet away. His breath was shallow, and his chest felt tight, as if the weight of the near-death experience had lodged itself inside him. His heart pounded erratically, and the ringing silence of the foggy night only seemed to magnify the chaos inside his head. He looked down at his phone, trying to steady his hands, but everything felt off. His thoughts kept racing, memories of the sudden slide, the bark from Max that had somehow pierced through the madness, and the moment the car came to a halt flashed in his mind. He couldn't drive home like this. He was in no condition to get behind the wheel again, not with his head spinning, his nerves raw, and the fog still thick around him. He knew he needed help, but the fog in his mind clouded his thoughts. He couldn't think straight. Mark scrolled through his contacts, fingers unsteady as he tried to find someone he could call. The confusion in his mind made everything feel distant, like he wasn't entirely present in his own body. The ringing in his ears grew louder, matching the frantic pace of his pulse. He needed someone to guide him, someone to help him out of this mess, but his mind was still trapped in the shock of what had just happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the phone connected and the familiar voice of his friend, Greg, echoed through the speaker. Mark's relief instant, but it was clouded with a lingering sense of dread. He hadn't even spoken yet, but Greg must have heard the shakiness in his voice. "Mark, what's wrong? Are you okay?" Greg's voice was urgent. I don't think I can drive anymore." Mark's voice cracked, his words slow, his breath still shallow. "I need help. I'm shaken, Greg. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end, but then Greg spoke, his voice a steady force amidst the chaos. "Stay where you are. I'll be there soon. Just breathe. You're going to be okay." Mark exhaled slowly, the first real breath he had taken since the accident. The world outside seemed to close in around him as he leaned back in the seat, still unable to shake the grip of panic. But the knowledge that help was on the way brought a small flicker of comfort. Max's desperation had reached its peak. Every scratch, every bark, every frantic move had been in vain. The door was locked. The window, too, was sealed tight. Max's mind was racing, and the storm of panic that had been brewing inside him now pushed him to the edge. He couldn't wait anymore. He couldn't sit by helplessly while Mark, his owner, his best friend, was out there, somewhere, in danger. Max turned away from the door, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. He paced back and forth, his muscles tense with frustration. His keen senses were alert to every sound, every movement outside the house, but nothing seemed to provide him the answer he desperately needed. There has to be a way out, he thought. There had to be something, anything that could get him to Mark. His paws hit the floor with urgency, each step a silent promise to himself that he would not give up. Max's heart was racing, a primal energy coursing through his body, his instincts screaming at him to act. He darted toward the back of the house, his tail tucked, his ears pinned back in focused determination. His body was a blur of motion as he searched for an opening, a way to break free. It wasn't the back door that Max was after this time, it was the small window at the side of the house. He had never been able to reach it before, but tonight he was different. He was no longer the calm, obedient dog he usually was. He was something else entirely. Every instinct was laser-focused on getting out, on reaching Mark before it was too late. Max's paws landed on the wooden windowsill, the sharp edge digging into his pads. But he didn't care. His muscles strained as he jumped, forcing himself higher, pushing past the pain. The window, usually too high for him to reach, was now within his grasp. With one final leap, Max's nose nudged the edge of the window open. He didn't hesitate. He forced his way through the narrow opening, his body squeezing through the gap as he landed on the cold ground outside. Max was free. He was out. And there was nothing in this world that was going to stop him from getting to Mark. His paws hit the ground with urgency, and without a second thought, he sprinted into the night, his instincts guiding him toward his owner. The danger wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. But Max was on his way, and nothing could stand in his way. Max's paws pounded the wet pavement, the sound of his frantic run barely audible over the heavy downpour. The rain had come suddenly, as if the sky itself was mourning, but Max didn't care. His fur was soaked, the cold water stinging his coat, but nothing could slow him down. His mind was singularly focused. Find Mark. Every step was driven by an unbreakable bond, a fierce determination that had taken over his entire being. The streets were slick with rainwater, the world around him a blur of headlights, puddles, and flashing streetlights. Max didn't pause. He darted across roads, his body low to the ground as he weaved between parked cars and speeding vehicles. His eyes were locked on the path ahead, his senses heightened to every sound, every shift in the air. He could smell it. Mark was somewhere out there, close. Max's heart raced with every beat, his adrenaline pushing him harder, faster. The first car nearly hit him, its tires screeching as the driver swerved at the last second. Max didn't stop. He barely noticed the danger, his body narrowly avoiding the spinning wheel, his instincts kicking in to propel him forward. The rain fell harder, the world growing darker, but Max's determination only burned brighter. His nose was flooded with the sense of the neighborhood, the wet earth, the distant smell of Mark's cologne, the trace of his footsteps. Max didn't hesitate as he crossed another road, the roar of traffic deafening, but his focus never wavered. A truck zoomed past, its tires splashing through the puddles, but Max was already on the other side, moving like lightning. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to keep going. He didn't know exactly where Mark was, but his instincts told him he was close. Max felt the urgency in his bones. He had to get there. He had to protect him. His paws slipped on the slick road, but Max was too quick to lose his footing. He picked up speed, his wet fur clinging to his skin, his mind locked onto one goal. Mark. The world around him blurred into nothingness. All that mattered was the connection they shared, the bond that was driving him through the rain-soaked streets. No road, no car, no obstacle could stop him. He could hear Mark's faint voice in his mind, urging him forward. Max's run became a blur of determination. He wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. Max's lungs burned with each breath, the cold rain stinging his face as he pushed forward through the downpour. His paws slapped against the wet pavement with urgency, his eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. His instincts were sharp, his every muscle stretched tight with determination. Mark, his mind repeated like a mantra, urging him onward. He was close now, so close he could feel it in his chest, that unspoken pull between them. A magnetic bond that only deepened with each step. Then, through the haze of rain and fog, something caught his eye. The faint glow of headlights, cutting through the mist. Max's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the shape of a familiar car, Mark's car. It was stopped at the intersection, barely visible in the distance, but it was there, unmistakably Mark's. The sight of it sent a wave of both relief and fear crashing over him. Max's pace quickened. He darted forward, his legs moving faster than he thought possible, the sound of his racing heartbeat thumping in his ears. The car was parked at the intersection, its headlights still shining, but the stillness of the scene felt wrong. Something about it made Max's stomach tighten with unease. His senses screamed at him. Something isn't right. As he neared the car, Max slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he approached cautiously. The rain fell heavier now, creating a curtain of mist that distorted his view. But he could still make out the shape of Mark in the front seat. Mark was slumped, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, but his head leaned forward, his body stiff. Max's pulse raced as he closed the distance, his every instinct telling him that the danger hadn't passed. Yes, the immediate threat of the crash had been avoided, but Mark was still vulnerable, still struggling. Max's heart ached, his mind raced with a mix of relief and dread. The danger had passed, but Mark was in no condition to drive, to move, to do anything. He was hurt, shaken, and Max knew that he wasn't out of danger yet. The bond between them flared up again, and Max's muscles tensed, ready to spring into action. Mark needed him, now more than ever. With a final burst of energy, Max reached the car, his paws tapping on the wet ground as he stood beside it. He didn't bark, he didn't whimper. He just stared at Mark, waiting, knowing his owner needed him, but not yet sure what to do. Max's heart raced as he approached the car, his paws slapping against the wet pavement with urgency. The rain was relentless, but the cold, biting weather couldn't distract him. His eyes were fixed on Mark, who was standing beside the car, his posture stiff, his body swaying slightly as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Mark's face was pale, his hands shaking as they rested on the car for support. He was alive, but clearly not okay. Still rattled, disoriented, struggling to regain his bearings after the terrifying ordeal. Max could feel the tension in the air. He could sense that Mark wasn't just physically shaken, but emotionally shaken as well. There was no time to waste. Mark needed him, and Max wasn't about to let him down. Without hesitation, the German Shepherd bounded toward him, his legs moving with purpose, his body driven by an instinct to comfort, to protect. His paws slid a little on the slick road, but he didn't slow down. He could see it in Mark's eyes, the fear, the confusion, and Max knew exactly what he had to do. As Max reached Mark, he gently nudged his owner's hand with his nose, pressing into him as if saying, "I'm here. You're not alone." The comforting nudge wasn't just physical. It was Max's way of grounding Mark, of pulling him back from the overwhelming flood of emotions and confusion. Mark's body stiffened for a moment, and then, slowly, he exhaled, his shoulders dropping in relief. Max didn't stop. He continued to press his body against Mark, wrapping his head around his leg, offering his unwavering presence. The warmth of Max's fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the gentle pressure of his body against Mark's side began to work their magic. Mark's hands stopped trembling, and he found himself leaning down, his face softening as he looked into the eyes of his dog, his protector. The world felt a little less heavy now. Mark's breath, once erratic, began to steady. He reached down to stroke Max's wet fur, the simple act of touch reminding him of the bond they shared. Max had been the one to pull him through this. It was Max's presence that kept him grounded. Slowly, Mark's body relaxed as he realized that despite everything that had happened, he was still here, still alive, and with Max by his side, he would be okay. Mark's hands rested on Max's wet fur, his breath finally starting to slow. But as he looked down at his German Shepherd, something shifted deep inside him. Max was wet, his coat clinging to his body, his eyes wide and full of intensity. There was a quiet urgency in the dog's gaze, an emotion Mark couldn't quite place, but it was clear. Max had never left his side. Through the fear, the danger, the confusion, Max had been with him every step of the way. The bond they shared, unspoken but so deeply felt, had carried them through this night. Mark knelt down slowly, his knees shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of realization settling on him. Max's eyes locked with his, unblinking, and in that moment, Mark saw it. It wasn't just loyalty. It wasn't just love. It was something deeper, something that went beyond anything he could have imagined. Max wasn't just his pet. He was his partner, his protector, his unwavering constant. Mark could feel the worry in Max's gaze, a worry that had driven the dog to break free, to fight against the locked door, to run through the rain just to find him. The connection between them was more than just a bond. It was a force that had kept Max by his side, even in the darkest of moments. Max's every action, every frantic moment of trying to reach him, had been driven by something pure and instinctual. Mark felt it in his chest, a deep stirring that moved him to his core. The way Max had kept him going through the terror of the crash, how Max had never left, never stopped trying to save him, made Mark realize just how far that loyalty reached. Mark's throat tightened as he reached down to gently stroke Max's head, his fingers combing through the wet fur. He could feel the warmth of the dog's body beneath the cold, wet coat. The bond they shared wasn't just unspoken. It was in every touch, every shared glance, every moment where Max had acted as his guardian. Mark realized, finally, how connected they truly were. In that moment, Mark understood the depths of Max's loyalty. It was unconditional, unwavering, and unbreakable. And as he looked into Max's eyes, he knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. Their bond was more than just a connection. It was a lifeline, and Mark would never take it for granted again. Mark took a deep breath, still feeling the weight of the night's chaos. His hands, no longer shaking, rested lightly on the steering wheel as he slid into the driver's seat, Max by his side, wet fur now sticking to the leather upholstery. The dog's steady presence next to him was a comfort, the warmth of his body grounding Mark in a way nothing else could. As Mark started the engine, the familiar hum of the car was oddly soothing after the terrifying silence that had followed the near miss. The road ahead was clear now, and as the headlights cut through the fog, Mark felt the tension that had gripped him for so long begin to ease, little by little. Max, still alert but no longer frantic, lay quietly in the passenger seat, his eyes occasionally flicking to Mark, as if checking to make sure his owner was okay. Mark's gaze kept flickering to him, and for the first time that night, he smiled, the corners of his lips lifting just slightly. The bond between them had only grown stronger, and Mark realized just how much he depended on Max, how much he needed him. There was no way he could have made it through tonight without him. It was a thought that echoed in his mind, but for now, all he could do was drive, focusing on the road ahead, the steady beat of his heart returning to something resembling normal. As they cruised down the empty streets, Mark's mind replayed everything. The chaos, the fear, the bark that had pierced through the fog and guided him back from the brink. He thought about the bond that had pulled Max through the night, the unspoken loyalty that had never wavered. Mark's thoughts drifted, and for a moment, he didn't know if it was the exhaustion from the emotional toll or the comforting presence of his dog beside him, but a sense of peace washed over him. The night wasn't over, but it felt like the danger had finally passed. The car turned onto their street, the familiar sights of home finally coming into view. Mark's chest tightened for a moment, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was a feeling of overwhelming relief. He had made it. They had made it. As he parked the car and turned off the engine, the stillness that followed was deafening. But it was a stillness Mark could finally breathe in. He wasn't just safe. He wasn't just alive. He was with Max. They were together, and no matter what had happened that night, that was enough. As the night deepened and the storm finally subsided, the house fell into an uneasy silence. The kind of silence that Mark had almost forgotten, the calm after the chaos. Inside, Max lay beside him on the floor, his body curled protectively near Mark's feet. The dog's eyes never fully closed. He was still alert, still on edge, his muscles taut with the remnants of the fear that had driven him throughout the night. Max's head rested on his paws, but every few seconds, his eyes would flick to Mark, checking to ensure that his owner was safe, that the danger was truly gone. Mark sat on the couch, his exhaustion heavy, but his heart was lighter than it had been just hours ago. He ran his fingers through Max's damp fur, the warmth of the dog's body grounding him in a way nothing else could. The bond between them was stronger than ever. Max had been his protector, his lifeline in the darkest of times. Mark knew he would never be able to truly repay the loyalty Max had shown him, but he could spend every moment of his life trying. The emotional toll of the night weighed heavily on Mark's mind, but with Max by his side, it felt like the world was still worth fighting for. The dog had sensed the danger long before Mark did, had fought through the panic, had broken free from the house, all to be there for him when he needed it most. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself the briefest of moments to soak in the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. The car, the accident, the storm, it all seemed distant now, washed away by the comfort of Max's presence. Max's loyalty never wavered, not for a second. His instincts had driven him to act when Mark couldn't, and in the end, it was Max who had been his hero. The dog had stood by him in the most uncertain of moments, and even now, as Mark drifted in and out of a weary sleep, Max stayed vigilant, always watching, always ready. But for now, the danger had passed. Max could finally relax. As his body softened, his breathing slowing, Max settled into the quiet night, the weight of the past few hours lifting. His instincts had saved Mark, but it was his loyalty that had carried them both through. And as the night settled into a peaceful calm, Max finally allowed himself the rest he had earned, knowing that no matter what tomorrow brought, his bond with Mark was unbreakable.